Okay. I really hope that works this time because that was silly. Okay, so this is the same drone sketch that we looked at Tuesday that there isn't a video for, and we're going to try and spend a few more minutes to try and add a little bit more detail, a little bit higher fidelity stuff to it. Where this concept is right now, normally I wouldn't go much farther because I haven't thought about all of these other details. I would probably do 2 or 3 more or 4 or 5 more of this style sketch, have a conversation with someone, do some detailed thumbnails about how these parting lines look, what the motor actually looks like, where the camera fits, that kind of thing. But let's say I've been through that process and this is the sketch I'm going to take to the next level. Fine, we'll do that. So I'm actually going to save a copy really quick. Yeah, sure, drone 3, that works. So a lot of the setup is still going to be the same, only this time, instead of using like fat, chunky shadows and highlights, we're going to use the airbrush, and we're also going to add some texture. So the first thing I'm going to do is add some texture. Let's say I wanted to show that this top orange material was in a kind of a textured material you would find on like a car dashboard. That plastic is usually like a little more rigid. So really, this is just like a Google exercise. So I'm gonna go in here and just search for like textured plastic. And one tip for searching for this stuff in Google textures, when you're in image search, you can go to Tools and change the size and make sure that everything you're finding is larger than a certain size. Generally, the higher resolution images are going to be ones that are more just like a generic texture. And wow, this one's actually orange too, which is kind of neat. I'm gonna pick just a gray one to show you how that works. Great, my plastic texture. Okay, so I'm going to save it after seeing like the full size one, maybe. There we go. There are some like annoying texture websites that won't let you see things the way that you want. I really need to like get my mouse out. Come on. Trying to right click here so I can just open it in a new tab. Alltextures.com. Oh good, here we go. Generally don't ever click anything that says start download on the internet. Really I just want to try and see this image. Yeah.
Is this like the equivalent of like downloading janky typefaces?
Yeah, kind of. Man, it's really not behaving right now. Where's my scissors tool or like scissors tool? All right, we're just gonna do it this super janky way. Oh, come on now. We're just gonna do a screen grab of this awesome texture. Cool, and I'm gonna save it. Yeah, you're right. It'll be fine. It's a. This is my texture plastic. Okay, high resolution would be better because it would end up giving me like a finer texture. Fine. That process can be kind of annoying. Let's go back here. So you can add an image in Sketchbook Pro. And I believe it adds it in like a new layer. So let's find it. There's my textured plastic. You can scale it. And I'm just going to like roughly scale it so it's on top of my entire like orange plastic area. That's fine. It did add it on a new layer, which is good. So there are a couple different blending options in Sketchbook Pro that will do a couple different things. So if you see I do multiply, it'll use this image to darken everything else behind it, but still keep that texture. That's usually not how I do it. Burns tend to also really saturate colors. They work better on grays. Yeah, linear burn is another one of those. You can use a lighten or a screen as an option on a texture, and it will basically just take the lightest parts of that and lighten everything up. In general, overlay I think is a pretty good way to overlay a texture on top of something that you already have drawn. It kind of does a blend between color burning and color dodging. It gives you a little bit of the darks, a little bit of the highlights, and it tends to like keep the color that you have. Another really good one would be soft or hard light, because it kind of does the same thing. It does like highs and lows for your texture. And there's no hard and fast rule about which one you should use. I would just say try a few. But you can see already, like, I have my texture there. If you want to increase or decrease the effect, you can change the opacity of that layer, and it will do the same. It'll basically just make it more intense or less intense. And then all the same rules apply about erasing and stuff. So usually I will bring in my texture and then get rid of the texture anywhere I don't want it. So if I just want this on the orange part, I'm going to go around and, just like so many other steps in Sketchbook, spend some time erasing the areas of this texture that I didn't want. Usually, if you spend the time, going around the edges and getting rid of most of this texture, you can speed up the process after the fact by finding just adjusting the size of your brush to erase all of the rest of the outside. This is something again in Photoshop, maybe one of the few things it can do much faster. Once you have masking set up for your layers, I could apply this texture to an area that I've already sort of outlined. Like if I'd already outlined this orange here, I wouldn't have to go through and re-erase everything else. Move this around. So make my brush a little bigger and just get rid of the rest of this texture. I would say adding texture is a cool way to make your objects feel a little bit more real, because most things that are molded in plastic have at least a little bit of tooth to them. At the same time, you don't want to go crazy with the texture on every single part, because it can be distracting from what it is you're trying to actually communicate. Another thing that you can do if you want to emphasize or de-emphasize texture, we'll talk about that here in a second. Another part of this process. Okay, so I've got my textures and I have my colors in place. Those steps are still there, and just as a reminder, before I did any of the color or anything else, there was this like under sketch thing that I did. It's not exactly in the same orientation anymore because we kind of rotated the view after the fact, but those steps still apply for this process too. So you'll notice that my hard light layer with the texture in it, I placed on top of my color layer. If I put it underneath, it's not gonna, it won't do anything because the color actually blocks it. You could change how the color layer blends, but this is generally the way to do it. Okay, so let's talk about a few airbrushing things. So because this is a more high fidelity rendering, I might want to do some more I guess like blended shadows, things that don't look quite as cartoony. And so I use a different set of brushes for that. Again, I'm going to try and keep all of my shading underneath my line work, but on top of my color. So I'm going to start creating some new layers also above my texture. I can probably actually just blend my texture in there. Ha! And of course, you see all this extra texture that I missed. That's my color. You know what? I will keep those layers separate for now. That's Okay, so there are a couple different airbrush tools. You can find them in these tool menus that we were talking about yesterday. There are a couple airbrush tools inside the designer set. There's airbrush, and then there's, I guess, tapered airbrush. I tend to use just the regular old airbrush, and that's because it's very consistent for me. So I'm going to start with shadow. And just like everything else in Sketchbook, it's going to be sort of like add some shading and then erase away the parts that I don't want anymore. The airbrush I use is generally pretty large. And let's say the light source for this object is sort of the same. It's going to be mostly on top of my object and slightly behind. So I'm going to start blocking in some areas of shade, some areas that I think are going to be shaded, like this rounded area. I'm going to try and shade first, and I'm not worried about how the rest, like these motor areas, are going to be shaded just yet. I'm mostly just worried about this center area here. That's probably all I really need. And I'm going to erase away parts that I don't want. That's probably it. I can also use a soft eraser. So like, let's say the front edge here, I think maybe doesn't need to be quite as in shadow. I can kind of come through and airbrush that shadow, back the shadow off a little bit. That's fine too. Okay, I'm gonna make a new layer and just go back to my airbrush. I want to darken up underneath, like the bottom of this thing, and maybe make sure I still see a little bit of light bouncing around like the back of this underside, and then get rid of the shadow. I only wanted it to be like the underside of that object right there. I was only worried about that like bottom part of the object. Alright, I'm going to make a new layer and then add some shadow to some of these arms. I am going to think a little bit about foreshadow too. Foreshadow on an object like this, with the light coming from the top, is probably going to be, basically it's going to be almost on the edge of these arms here, but I am going to leave a little bit of room for light to like bounce around the edges of those objects. Notice I am going pretty dark. It's fine to go dark because you can always back your shadows off again after the fact. Alright, and I'm going to erase away some of this area on the outside. So as I'm adding the shadows, I'm really not worried about overshooting because I can always erase away. Shadow shouldn't go on the inside of these motor mounts. I'm going to make sure that's not the case. That's probably fine. So I'm just going to keep going through this process of adding shadow layer by layer, kind of part by part, until I'm happy with it. Layer, try and get the inside of this motor mount here, and then erase away the outside of that shadow. I left the texture on the inside there, which is not exactly right. You can also use like a smaller soft eraser to kind of like make the edges of your shadows not quite as harsh. Like this, I don't imagine is like a sharp edge that holds the motor in place. So I can go back through and soften it up with a soft brush or a soft eraser. Alright, let's add some shadow there, add some shadow this side. Oop, I forgot to make a new layer. I'm trying to do each one of these new shadows as its own layer so that when I go back and erase, I'm not erasing a shadow that I already have in place. So I can go through this whole thing. That's probably fine for now. That's sort of just main body area shadows. Another type of shadow that I would probably want to add are the cast shadows that we were talking about last time. Those I typically still add with a harder brush. Cast shadows tend to have like harder edges and they're a little bit darker. I'm making my cast shadows in a multiply layer, and actually, I forgot to do that for these two. Multiply as opposed to just doing like a normal layer for shadows will help keep some of the color that's already in there in place. Some people also like to do burning. That tends to, I think it kind of makes the color a little bit weird. I don't know why it's not. Maybe I do want to merge these guys. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Cast shadow. So like the inside of my motor mounts probably have that same shadow on the inside. And again, I'm going to go back and erase away the areas that I don't want. And you can tell, like, because I have to add value and then erase for almost every one of these steps, this process takes a little bit more time. And that's one reason why I don't usually go to airbrushing unless it's more of a like final hero shot rendering. It's easy to get carried away adding lots and lots of shadows and highlights. But it's also going to be really fun because you can get a result that's I guess just really cool, really persuasive. Got like kind of glitchy. It sounded like the fan kicked on. Okay, I think we're getting somewhere. The lighting on this is also pretty dramatic, and that's just because I want it to be dramatic. Let's see, we can get rid of the shadow on the outside edge here. I must have missed that the last time. I missed a cast shadow on the inside here. I might soften up some of these just a little bit too. Okay, so there's my cast shadow. and my other shading based on like the normal light projection here. I'm going to add some highlights too. Highlights I can also do with my soft brush, and it's sort of the same process, only they're going to be in different locations. I will show you sort of the difference between like a highlight on a, I guess like a matte or textured surface versus one on a shiny surface. Airbrushing generally gives you like a generic highlight on what would be considered not like a glossy surface, more of a matte surface, and that kind of shading really communicates the overall volumetric form more so than like surface quality. In these renderings though, you might want to communicate some like shiny surfaces as well. And there's a way to do that. So which one of these should be shiny? Is it? Okay. Thank you. Oh, we do have to do sketchbooks. It's okay to be that person. I need that person because I forget about this kind of stuff.
We just let them build up. Okay, you have 300 sketches to do.
Yeah.
Don't forget. Yeah.
I'm going to go back and add another low light here really quick. The inside.
Yeah.
You alright, Kennedy? Okay. I have highlights and I have lowlights, and they're all pretty extreme for now, which is fine. What was the next thing I wanted to do? Oh yeah, so another thing we didn't do last time that can really help emphasize edges in a sketch is go back and use a pencil tool, and basically anytime you have two pieces of material coming together, there will be a slight highlight on usually both of those edges. To simplify things for a sketch, I'll want you guys to try and pick one of those edges to highlight, usually the one that's facing the light source, or in general the top of the object. So to give you an example, like this piece of plastic is supposed to separate, man, which way do I want to draw this here? And am I on a new layer? So I'm going to come in and add a highlight to the top of that piece of plastic. It's subtle. This is just my normal design pencil, yeah. You can use a much thicker brush if you want that more like heavy cartoony look. In general though, in a more final drawing, even these lines are maybe a little bit loose or a little bit cartoony. You can sort of thin up all of your line work and it'll make it seem a little bit more tight. Again, that's like, with lots and lots more practice, you'll get better at using lighter lines and having them still line up and stuff. So I'm just going to add a few highlights to the top edge of some of these parts. And it should help really emphasize those areas. It's also going to take some of the areas that really got lost in shadow and bring them back out so that you kind of see what's happening. I might want to bring out my ellipse tool again for some of the ones that are on these motors. because again, these are like concentric highlight things. I also like to try and keep my highlights not lined up exactly with one of the black lines. I like to try and stack them up next to each other. It also helps add that idea of like a gap between two parts of plastic that are meeting. So that's like parting line stuff. You can also add some slightly thicker highlights to the top edges of like these motor mounts, because that would probably catch some light too, and it just helps bring that edge forward a little bit. Really, you can kind of go crazy with the highlight edges because there really aren't very many places where they look bad. But usually I'll add them in areas where I want to show an abrupt change in surface, or actually show like a parting line between two pieces of plastic or metal or whatever other material you have. Yeah, okay. So I could probably add a bunch more. Yeah, ask away.
When you're visually sketching, do you have a tendency to do you feel like further away from the sketch, if that makes sense? Or does that go away with time once you get more?
It's definitely different. I find it much more difficult to think in a digital sketch than I do on the page. And maybe a lot of it has to do with the fact that at this point, what I'm doing is very technical. I'm like trying to take this object that I have a very good understanding of what it's supposed to look like in my head and add light and shadow to make it look more dramatic. That is a much more technical process to me than actually like thinking through an idea and thinking about arrangement of components and how plastic is supposed to come together. So I think, to answer your question, I do feel a little bit more far away from the idea, but that's also because I am farther away from the idea at this point. I'm a little bit more into the details of how to render the surface to make it look really attractive and communicative. Yeah.
Which is less tactile, like when that's on paper, you get that rough feeling almost.
Definitely.
And it's kind of like a little more removed from that
It
physical nature.
absolutely is. Some of these brushes, and you can actually get different nibs for like the Wacom pen. Some of them are like made of felt or paper or something like that, and they bring some of that back, and they're really nice. I stopped using them because they wear out and they're kind of expensive over time. But it's worth taking a look at if that's something you really want to try and use. Let's see. Oh, that's like a weird pencil. Okay, the other type of highlight I sometimes like to add is, hotspots is the name for it. I couldn't think of the name for it before. Adding some like flair, basically. Usually, like, there are spots on round surfaces and on like corners that will pick up like a very sharp highlight. If you look at something shiny, like I'm getting a hot spot like right here on the bottom of this like beveled edge. I'm getting one on the corner and like up here in this corner. Those kinds of things can really help add like a level of, oh my gosh, it's huge. And literally it's just like drawing a dot or a couple dots, depending on your light source, on some of these areas that would really pick up the light. And it is kind of flair, it's a little bit extra.
Sparkle.
Yeah, a little bit of sparkle, but it can help add a little bit of, I don't know, intrigue to your drawing too. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Last things I kind of wanted to show you, and I know we're getting a little bit late. So once you're happy with this thing, there are a couple post-process extra things that you can do, and I'm going to like merge a couple of these layers, like the highlights, together and name them highlights so I don't forget. That's cast shadows. That is just like core shading. I'll save that. Okay, one of the things we started talking about a little bit with your sketch compositions was trying to emphasize a single idea or find a focal point for each of the sketches that you put on the page. And there are ways to do that. There are ways to do that after the fact as well. So I'm going to really quick make a, is there anything on that layer? No. I'm going to make a folder and throw all of this stuff in the folder really quick, this group 1 folder. I'm going to duplicate it, hide my original folder, and then combine all of that stuff together. So now I have like a single layer that has everything that I just did on it. Sometimes when you do this, you'll notice that there were some areas on like multiply or highlight layers that like come out and look really ugly. You can clean that up, and I'm actually going to clean that up really quick before I get into this next thing.
If you invert, like, you have Linework, you can use the random tool, and then just take a photo of this.
Say what?
Like, if you have like little bits, and like you can go to your Linework layer, and then use the magic wand tool to select everything outside your
Ooh, cool.
Linework, and then just put a bit of this in.
Clear everything out. I am already past that point because I merged everything, but it also, it works better with closed lines,
You can
yeah.
bring down the columns.
Alright.
Tessa, do you know
Okay, that's
what
enough.
the port we have on our side is?
Like the name of it?
Like, are we able to even like
Do you have a mini display?
move the display port?
Maybe display is something that
Yeah,
Apple
the Apple one uses. I use that for my Linework.
So do you
Alright.
use like a lightning?
No,
I brought another version of my Linework on top of this group that has everything in it, and you'll see why in a second. So one way that you can, like, let's say I want to emphasize the, like, where the camera goes and maybe just the front of my drone right here. I can actually go back with a really big soft eraser and start to erase some of the color from behind, and it'll really add, really it draws your eye to the front of this thing. Another thing that you can do, let me show another thing you can do really quick. So I made another copy of everything underneath here. You can do that with your, like, just your shadow and your, like, multiply, your highlight layers, your texture. Let me just get rid of all that stuff. So the color is still there, but now I'm really just emphasizing like the shadow on the front. So there are a couple different ways that you can, I don't know, just draw the attention to an important part of the sketch. The cool thing about doing this digitally is that this is something you can do entirely in post. And if you know ahead of time that that's something you want to do, you might only spend time shading, like really shading the front of this, and leave this as like blocked out color, because like I just did, I just erased all of the texture and everything from the back of this guy. Another thing that is fun to do sometimes, I'm just gonna, I'll leave that here. Let's say that's the way I want it to look, is going into vignetting. Well, okay, I'll try a couple things really quick. So I rarely use this straight edge tool because actually there are rarely straight edges in sketches. Even like cubes and things, if you draw them with like a slight arc, it makes them feel more sketchy. No, we haven't talked about that yet. But this ruler tool is one that works very similarly to the ellipse template, where it will act as a guide for drawing a straight line. And it does show you the angle down in the bottom, like if you want to get a perfectly up and down line, you can. And then in here, there is this like gradient fill or bucket fill tool that should just like, just kidding. It should be closed. Is there, of this bucket tool, flood fill? Maybe I'm not using the right one. You know what, I might just select the inside of this the old-fashioned way, and then fill it in. And then deselect. Get out of this selection. This is something also that you can like erase, or let's say I want more contrast in the front, I can erase away like the back of this, maybe duplicate it and say multiply, so you really get like this transition from back to front. Like that might help. Oh, and then afterwards, I can create a layer on top of my vignette and come in with like just a white. You can erase it, or I'll just draw like white behind my object, and it makes it be the color it's supposed to be. Yeah, that's one way to do it for vignetting. I'm noticing for the video too, like this bottom edge kind of gets lost. This might be a good time to go back in and add a highlight to the bottom edge of that drone so it really pops it off the page. Another thing that you can do if you don't want to do a vignette is, let's make a new layer and use an airbrush of like a really dark, actually maybe I want to go with that like green color again, like a really dark color. Just like a giant brush. And again, if it's something that will help it pop off the page, you're welcome to do that kind of thing. This is a drone and it's supposed to be moving really quick, so I might do something different and actually start like, yeah, like try and pull some tails off the side of this thing.
Like I heard her sound, but I didn't comprehend what she said.
I could put flames on it. I don't know. And this is probably something where like you could find some really good examples of how to do what you're trying to do. I think you're right. It is failure of design. Yeah, I'm not happy with this at all. You can play around with all of the like the background element stuff too. Another thing that you can do. Yeah, is it time? All right, I get it. You can. So what I just did was I have a layer with all of my highlights, color, everything on it. I duplicated it, and then I changed its type to one of the other types, like linear dodge in this case. Notice how a linear dodge like really pops the colors and totally, it'll even wash out some of the, sunny. Yeah, it's like sunny. And then on that layer, I can erase away the areas that I want less of that pop. So it's like, boom, this is now like the hottest, like most, yeah, highlight area of this sketch, which could be cool. It's so hot right now. That Hansel. Yeah, okay. Oh my god, Zoolander. Anyway, so there's a lot of stuff, and we'll continue to talk about other ways that you can, I don't know, make your renderings juicy, but Sketchbook is a really powerful tool, and it gives you a lot of ways to do that. So I'm just going to save this out as it is for now. Don't feel like you need to go this far with anything really right now. I would only attempt this stuff on like your main hero images for like one view on your composition. Honestly, you can. This is a time suck wormhole. You could spend a day like really going all out on one of these images. It also can be kind of intimidating. And like Steven said, once you have the ability to take a sketch or a rendering really, really far, it's easy to feel like you have to take every single idea that you put on a page that far, and that's not the case at all. Like the biggest thing, again, stepping back, and I know you guys want to take off, that I want you guys to walk away from this class is, okay, these are the skills that I have to express ideas, and I know what times I should actually use those different techniques to express an idea. This level of rendering doesn't happen much until like the very end of a design process. So, okay, that's my demo for today. We'll do sketchbooks during SolidWorks class. Please, Kennedy, remind me.
I will try my best, but
And I'm going to stop.